Hello, Frizzle Fixies. Our game today is to review the last 9 books I read through the game of putting them against each other and asking myself, of these books, which one would I rather reread, rewrite, or recycle? And we're going to be doing this in 3 rounds. So for round 1, the books are Jade City, Starter Villain, and Frankenstein. You know, these books scare me because I gave all of them the same rating, and that means left in the cup is going to be quite a diverse amount of ratings, which makes all of these rounds more difficult because there isn't any clear winners and losers here. The recycle gets to go to Jade City. So let's talk about that. Jade City is exploring these fantasy kind of Chinese-inspired gangs. And the thing that these gangs revolve around is jade. If you have the right bloodlines and you wear jade stones, you can get magical powers, such as being super strong or super fast or being able to sense people's auras. And this story follows a bunch of different people that are all part of this crime family as it's going through some political unrest. The old leader of the mob has recently retired and left his spot to his grandson, and you get the story of him trying to grow into this leadership role and also of his siblings and a few other scattered people in the clan. And you know what? This book was boring. This book is boring because it tried to hang its stakes on this mob war, where you have these 2 rival clans and they're fighting for territory and dominance. The problem was that I didn't really care about who won this clan war. It didn't actually have any emotional stakes in it. This book splits its perspective amongst many narrators, and pretty much none of them get character arcs. And pretty much none of them are people that I want to root for because all they really care about and are obsessed with is gathering jade and this gang war, and 2 things that I don't have any reason to care about because I don't care about the characters in the first place. One of the things that's extra disappointing wrapped up in all of this is that this book is very hyped on booktube. It's one of the booktube darlings that people in the fantasy community are always raving about, and I don't get it. This book feels so flat and boring and way too long and bloated and has way too many perspectives, and none of them are interesting. Why is this book so popular? I don't get it. I rated Jade City 3 stars, and its book tone is Gainsborough Grey. Book tone is a reader personality test that I designed. I'll link it down in the footnotes for you to take it if you want. And the type Gainsborough Grey means it's kind of a mix of all the other types and intellectually focused. Next book, we've got Starter Villain versus Frankenstein. And I have a pretty fun idea of how to rewrite Frankenstein, so let's talk about that. So this is the first time I've read Frankenstein. I did escape getting assigned it in school somehow. And it was fine, you know, probably better than the average classic that I had to read in school, but not anything to write home about. I liked plenty of things about this book, and you can go see the things that I liked because I vlogged my experience of reading this book, and I'll link it down in the footnotes. But let's focus in on something that I didn't like as much, which was the second half, because the second half devolves quickly into Victor Frankenstein versus the monster that he's created just trying to ruin each other's lives, and they're just both really sad and obsessed about this. And I really didn't find that compelling because at the point when you're on that track of they are determined to ruin this person's life, even if they ruin their own life in the process, I am no longer interested because there isn't any stakes in it. There's nothing on the line because either way the character is on the tracks to their own self-destruction, and the only way that these types of plot lines can redeem themselves in my mind is if the character has some growth and manages to abandon their dreams of vengeance. And the characters in this book don't. So I found the ending of this book very lackluster and depressing. So I was thinking about how could we improve this book, and I had the wildest idea, but the more I think about it, the more I love it. And if you want to hear me rant and elaborate on this more, again, check out the video where I'm reviewing Frankenstein. So bear with me here. The ending of Frankenstein would be so much improved if it turned into a monster romance. Midway through the book, you have Frankenstein versus his monster, and they are just at each other's throats and sworn enemies. But they haven't really done anything that evil to each other yet. So this relationship is salvageable, and that is how I would rewrite Frankenstein. That is the story I want to read, is enemies coming together and having to put in the mental and emotional work to understand each other enough that they can then love each other. And it doesn't have to be a romance. I would be just as happy if these 2 came together and became best friends. But it's just the fact that the place where they are in the middle of the book is the same place they are emotionally at the end of the book that bothers me so much. It feels like an entire waste of the second half of this book, and I feel like it would would be so more compelling if instead, where they are at the midpoint of the book is complete opposite of where their relationship is with each other at the end of the book because of great character development they'll have to go through. I gave Frankenstein 3 stars and its book tone is uranium blue. And that leaves me to reread Starter Villain. So first I want to take a minute to appreciate this beautiful cover. Yeah, it's gorgeous, isn't it? I love how bold the cat is. And before I picked up this book, I was wondering, like, are the cats really that important? Is this a book about cats? It's not quite a book about cats. The main characters are humans. However, there are many cat, let's call them familiars, running about that become characters in their own right. Because every good supervillain needs a cat, right? And this story is about a guy who has a rich uncle that he's never really talked to, but then that uncle dies and the guy inherits his businesses, which turns out is an empire of supervillainy. So this is the story as he gets to know his uncle's supervillain empire and decides how he wants to run it, as he's also coming into conflict with the other supervillains in the business who aren't so happy with this new kid on the block. This book is very entertaining and easy to read. I think I read it in 2 sittings. I do think it's lacking a little bit of depth that I was craving, but for what it is, kind of like a comedy satire, it's very interesting. And that is why I would reread it. Because even if it is a perfect book, I would have fun rereading this one. Something that I think you need to know going into this book is, though the tone of it is pretty cartoony, you aren't going to get the fun cartoon supervillain like a Dr. Doofenshmirtz out of this book. Because this book is much more interested in exploring, in general, billionaires, where all of these supervillains are, 1, comedically stupid at times, and 2, have more money than they can use. It's kind of got like Elon Musk vibes. I rated Starter Villain 3 stars, and its book tone is unmellow yellow, which means it's emotional and atmosphere focused, and the atmosphere is all satire comedy. Next, we're moving on to round 2 with A Quiet Vengeance, The Curse of Chalion, and A Study in Drowning. So the first decision here is so easy because I am rereading A Study in Drowning because I loved this book so much. A Study in Drowning takes place in like a Welsh-inspired fantasy world set in like 1930s-ish. And our main character is a college girl named Effie, and she's obsessed with this novel about this girl who slays and outwits the fairy king. And the reason that Effie is so obsessed with this book, right, speaks to her so much, is that Effie hallucinates the fairy king stalking her. And this is the book that gives her comfort and makes her feel sane. And one of the things that's so clever about this book, even to the end, and even once I finished the book, I'm a little unsure of whether or not there's actually magic, of whether or not the fairy king is real. Where this book perfectly straddles that line where it gives you just enough proof to think that maybe the fairy king is actually stalking Effie, but also gives you just enough of Effie being an unreliable narrator who does have hallucinations that you're not really sure if it's real or not. And that just goes through the entire book. And I kept going back and forth of like, is this even a fantasy novel? So like, good luck figuring it out. And the plot of this book is that Effie is an architecture student, and she wins this contest to go out into the countryside to the house that once belonged to her favorite author to design a renovation for it. And there at that manor in the countryside is also another student, and these 2 students strike up a rivalry flirtationship relationship, which is so fun. This book is hauntingly gothic. It can be describing the most mundane of activities, and I'm on the edge of my seat. It's so engrossing and atmospheric and just beautifully written. The plot itself of the book often feels almost too easy. Like if our characters are trying to solve a mystery, the clue will always be in the first place that they look, and it'll always be the exact clue that they need. Because the challenge and conflict of this book isn't so much this mystery that they're solving, though it is a fun mystery. It is more Effie's mental health. It's more both other people around Effie and you as the reader deciding whether or not to believe all of her stories and ideas. It's very much a book wrestling with the themes of like, when do you believe young women? And what impact your belief and disbelief can have on them and their world. Anyway, this book is exquisite. I gave it 5 stars. And its book tone is jade green, which means it's emotional and atmosphere character focused. Next up, we've got A Quiet Vengeance versus Curse of Chalion, and I think we will have to recycle 𝐂𝐸𝐻𝐿 Vengeance. The genre is a little bit hard to explain. It takes place in like a Middle Eastern inspired fantasy world that's a little bit pre-industrial revolution vibes. But the world is also like post-apocalyptic, so sometimes there are ruins that are much greater technology level than the base. We are following two characters in two different timelines. In the past, we're following this preteen girl named Nimsa, and she is a street rat who works for the mob finding information. And along the way, Nimsa meets Prince Dojon, a boy about her age who is next in line for the throne, and he is our other narrator in the present timeline. Where after some disastrous events in their youth that you get to find out through the past timeline, they've reunited in the present as Nimsa has grown up to become a banker, and they both go to a neighboring kingdom to try to negotiate some mercenary and trade deal stuff. So the world building, the premise, the political setup in this book is exquisite. But the reason that I would recycle this is I thought that the ending of this book was pretty underwhelming. The character arcs of both of our narrators feel kind of unfinished, and while the dangling plot threads do get mostly wrapped up, they get wrapped up in like the most quiet, underwhelming way where a lot of it happens even off screen. And it just left me finishing this book like with a whisper of fizzle of disappointment. So despite loving the beginning, in the end I gave 𝐂𝐸𝐻𝐿 Vengeance 3 stars. And its book tone is Celadon Green, which means it's intellectual and a mix of atmosphere character focus. Which leads me to rewrite The Curse of Chalion. If this hadn't been up against A Study in Drowning, I would have reread this book, but now I have to come up with a way to improve it. Ugh, that's hard. So Curse of Chalion takes place in a world where there are 5 mostly benevolent gods that sometimes meddle in the affairs. And our protagonist finds himself in this unlucky situation where it seems like the gods want to use him as a tool in different ways throughout the book. But the plot starts off with him having recently escaped from slavery in a neighboring kingdom, but he's escaped, he's made his way back to his hometown, he just wants a quiet life, and then he's pressed into service as being a secretary to like the crown princess, which gets him back involved in the politics world that he was trying so hard to get away from that got him into slavery in the first place. And I love this book. I love how emotionally raw it is as it's exploring like the PTSD of our main character. I adore our lovable cast of characters and all the nice sidekicks and friends that he has along the way. I love the relationship between our hero and the big villain of this piece. If I were to rewrite one thing about this book, there's a long stretch of this book where our main character has getting tangled up in the curse of Chalion, and because of this, he expects to die. And he just kind of accepts this and moves on, but I think if I was rewriting this, I would want 1, more angst of him really not wanting to die and finding reasons that he wants to live and gaining a new spark and zest for life despite of this death sentence curse hanging over him. I highly recommend The Curse of Chalion. It's an extended universe series with a bunch of different books, but this book in itself is a standalone and you can read it just by itself without any of the other books. I gave Curse of Chalion 4 stars and its book tone is Gainsborough Gray. Okay, moving on to round 3, City of Bones. And no, not the one by Cassandra Clare, the one by Martha Wells. Magic Tides and the next book in the series, Magic Claims. And Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I think we will have to rewrite City of Bones. It's called City of Bones because it takes place mostly in this one city, and there's some people in the city that do like bone-burning magic. That doesn't actually become very important. I think this book is fairly mistitled. Because what actually becomes important is that our main character, Kat, he isn't quite human. He comes from this fantasy race of people that live out in the desert, and they're almost human, but they also have like marsupial pouches and other little things. But he has been kind of exiled from his people out in the desert, and now he's moved to this city, and he has become an antique relic dealer. And then this book kicks off with kind of one of the magical police warder people and asking for him to lead an expedition out into the desert for them, because the desert's really dangerous and they know he can handle it, in order to investigate some relics out there. And it turns out some of these relics are quite magical, and the plot kicks off with that. I think I would want to give more personal motivation and things on the line for our protagonist, because he starts out on this expedition just kind of wanting the money. And then he kind of cares in abstract that the artifacts are like dealt with fairly and shared with the academic community, but he's actually involved that personally with the academic community. So why is he participating so much in this plot? Why does he care so much about what happens to these magic relics? And I don't feel like the book really gives a satisfactory answer. I think our main character needs more motivation. Maybe you could make him more directly involved in academia, and then maybe you can tie it in more with his angsty heritage with the desert people and caring that these artifacts came from the desert and so are part of that culture that he's kind of still attached to and has kind of turned his back on. But whatever it is, I feel like he needs a more personal reason to be pursuing this matter, other than just like vague nebulous, it's the right thing to do, I guess. I gave City of Bones 3 stars, and its book tone is Xanthus Orange, which is intellectual and a mix of plot atmosphere focus. Then we have Yumi and the Nightmare Painter versus Magic Tides, and I think the recycle, and I rated these books the exact same thing, but one of them gets to be reread and one of them gets to be recycled, so I think the recycle has to go to Magic Tides. This is the first book of a sequel series to the Kate Daniels books. The Kate Daniels books are about a woman named Kate, and she is like a magical bounty hunter that over the course of the series grows in power and gains friends and magic and ends up fighting apocalypses and stuff. So now these new books, Magic Tides and Magic Claims, take place years after those events where Kate battled dark gods and saved the world and stuff. And now her and her husband have just retired. They don't want any more of that crazy life. They don't want to be known as heroes, they just want peace. And then of course problems come to their small town that they've retired to, and they still have hero in their bones, so they can't help but help and accidentally restart their heroic careers. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed this book, but I don't think there's quite enough like depth and heart for me to enjoy rereading them, which is why they get to be recycled this time. But I loved the vibe of these heroes that were once gung-ho heroes that have now become reluctant heroes and wrestling with that. But I don't feel like there was quite enough emotional angst and internal conflict there to propel it into awesome level, which is why these books got 4 stars from me. Oh, and I want to make a quick point about the audiobook narrators. There's 2 of them, one for Kate and one for her husband, and they are different narrators than narrated the main series, but they do a very good job at feeling about the same, and I do recommend the audiobooks here. And the book tone is Vermilion Red, which is emotional and plot focused. Which leads me to reread Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Part of my enjoyment of this book is that I read it with my husband, who was obsessed with it, so that did bring some extra joy into my enjoyment of it. And if you want to see our review of it, I'll link that in the footnotes for you. Long story short, this is like Japan and Korean culture inspired fantasy, where we have a guy who goes by Painter. He's got like this rote day job where he's painting magical nightmares, don't worry about it, and he's kind of emo and depressed. And then on a completely different world, we have Yumi, and she is very passionate about her art job, which is stacking rocks in order to summon spirits, and she's very confined by her role as this holy priestess. And then these 2 characters start body swapping and interacting with each other through ghostly forms along the way. And then they fall in love. And for a large portion of this book, it's just that. It's just them getting to know each other, getting to know each other's worlds as they body swap. And through them both being pushed outside of their comfort zone here, they get to have some nice character development along the way. And then near the end, there are several plot twists which crank the book into gear and propel us into a Sanderlanche. The author of this book, Brandon Sanderson, is famous for his incredibly fast-paced endings where everything seems to be happening all at once, and this book definitely has one of those, despite having a slower beginning and middle. And that is why I would want to reread this book. I think it would be very interesting to reread this book knowing the plot twist going in from the beginning. It's a heartwarming, fun, and lovable, entertaining book, and it's the best time I've had with Brandon Sanderson book in quite a few years, so it kind of saved that for me a little bit. I rated Yumi and the Nightmare Painter 4 stars, and its book tone is Celadon Green. And those are the last 9 books I read. Have you read any of them? What do you think of them, and what have you been reading recently? Anything you want to recommend to me? I am always open to that. Thanks for watching.